Scalable forms in Vue. So forms are obviously not maybe the most exciting thing, maybe not why you really wanted to be here. And alcohol is about to get served. So I promise if you guys do a good job of listening, I will release the alcohol to you, okay? But you have to listen well. Scalable forms in Vue. What is scalability? What are we talking about here? Well, really we can think about this sort of in two different ways. On a server, we think about scalability more in terms of like, hey, load balancers and horizontal or vertical scaling. We think about things like requests per second versus on the client side, which is what we're going to talk about more today. What would scalability look like on the client side? More like code reusability, the size of your organization, how many developers are working on this. Developers per project might be a metric. Evan actually had an interesting quote in a podcast recently. He was talking about Vue 2 and some of the people who had issues in Vue 2. He said, Vue 2 has scalability issues. We have a huge Vue product and we have these huge components that nobody wants to touch anymore. We don't know how to extract and reuse things. Okay, so if you listen carefully to that, you can start to pick up some of the key fundamentals of what it takes to have a reusable, extracted, scalable front end. Real quick on me, my name's Justin Schrader, as he said so eloquently. You can follow me on the little X thing, and I mostly consider myself an open source creator at this point. So FormKit, Arrow.js, AutoAnimate, Tempo, Drag and Drop, and VueFormulate are some of the projects that I've created and worked on. And yeah, they're all open source, so hopefully you guys go check them out. Okay, back to scalable front ends. So a scalable front end, here's my little rubric that I'm going to use. This is, should I be more still? More stone-like here to prevent the clickety-clack? Here's my rubric. 1, enables code reuse. 2, it encourages best practices. 3, it's approachable for all skill levels. And 4, is conducive to teams of developers. Okay, so that's roughly what I want to talk about, is how do we do that with our forms? Now, if we think about front ends, I think we can roughly divide almost all front ends that exist into roughly 2 categories. Your sites and your apps. And my definition of that is sites are generally going to be content heavy, minimal interactivity. So think about like a blog or something like that. And they have limited business logic versus an application, which is highly interactive, a lot of interaction with the consumer. They're logic heavy and generally extensive forms. In fact, I would say that applications are so extensive on the forms, you could almost just call them forms. They're like forms with a little bit of gloss on them. And if you've been a developer for very long, I guarantee that you have been doing this. I know it for sure. So how are we going to implement our complicated form application thing? Well, plan A would of course be to use the form data API. It, after all, uses the platform. It has native validation. It's 0 kilobytes of JavaScript over the wire, and it works with any server. So this is clearly going to be the best way to do this. But as Mike Tyson would tell you, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. You guys have probably been punched in the mouth by trying this approach before, and if you haven't, it's in your future, I promise. The reality is the platform can't really structure data. You can only get a flat list of your fields. Native validation rules are extremely limited. HTML lacks basic interactivity, and there's not even a standard body parser. Like, we think that form data will be parsed in a standard way by backends, but even that's not true. And the reality is your API was probably already written to accept JSON, which form data doesn't support. Okay, plan B. We're not going to use the form data API. Instead, we're going to use form components. That sounds good, right? Components. So let's write an input component, okay? And the advantage of writing an input component is we're going to be able to do a bunch of important things, like have accessible markup. We're going to have really delightful validation. Maybe they could even animate in, things like that. Our props are going to allow us to customize these things out the wazoo. It's going to be great. And we're going to support things like vModel, which of course is a Vue concept. You have probably written this component before. Who has written like the text input component? Wow, yeah, okay, so most of us have written this component. Let's write it anyway. Text input, here it is. All right, we're going to define a whole litany of props. And here we've got our define model right at the top. And you can see that we're going to use this to model the input data coming out of our text input. And we're going to be good citizens by having things like a for attribute with an ID, which references the ID on the text input. And we're going to do things like have an optional help text, which is used with an aria described by, so that way we make sure that they're semantically linked. We're going to be good citizens on the accessibility front. All right, now in our application, we could use this by just now using text input instead of our input. And I know that you guys have done this before. We're v-modeling our form data up here, and you can see that down on our text input, we're gonna model this. Okay, tailwind, right? This starts to get ugly. Now we've got to somehow get a bunch of classes from the top down in there. There's a lot of those. And then our errors. So this is a little bit ugly, but it's not too bad. We got to somehow pass errors down into our component to display them inside of there. So let's just do a quick examination here. Does it match our rubric? Does it enable code reuse? Sure, we could just use text input twice, right? Does it encourage best practices? Sure, why not? How about, is it approachable for all skill levels? I think it's much easier to probably use that text input than it was all of those aria attributes on your own. So sure, it's generally more approachable, and it's conducive to a team of developers. Yeah. Now, I'd like to examine this enables code reuse just a little bit more. Let's try to actually reuse this. Okay, so here's our text input again. And now we're going to create a new component. We don't just forget about the Tailwind classes for a bit. We're going to create a new component. It's going to be the user.view component. And here we go. The user.view is just going to have two text inputs in it. We've got form data with our first name and form data with our last name, okay? And this code should be pretty understandable, pretty straightforward. But of course, all you eagle-eyed observers are going to notice that we've just made a little faux pas at least. We have all of this data that's being piped in here, which is not in the scope of this component, right? We're going to need to get that from somewhere else. Okay, so let's back up one component. Let's go back up to our view component here. Now here's how we would actually use this, right? We've got our user component, and now we're going to pass in the vmodel for the last name, the vmodel for the first name, last name errors, and first name errors as they're being computed. But the reality is, you know, it'll look more like this, right? Because pretty soon we're going to need some flags of like whether we're going to show the errors or not. We need to be tracking the states of how those inputs are being treated, like the blur states. Is it dirty? What's the initial value? Things like that. This gets very ugly very fast. And I hope I'm preaching to the choir, because I think most of us have probably experienced something like this. So if we go back to the rubric, I don't really think this actually enables very good code reuse, because what we've just done is we've tightly coupled our user to the higher implementation, because it needs to pipe all that data in. Also, is this really encouraging best practices? Well, maybe a little bit. It's just going to get messy. I haven't even written the implementation for all those functions. It's going to get messy. Is it beneficial for all skill levels? Probably not. We might actually be better by not having written our text input in the first place. And conducive to a team of developers? Hell no, absolutely not. So the reality is that components are not enough. But forms are hard. We have a lot of things to deal with when we're writing forms. Yes, there's state management. That's basically what we just talked about. But there's a lot more. There's all that boilerplate code. We didn't even talk about non-native inputs. We just use a text input. But how about something like an autocomplete? You've got, structured data. The code reuse is poor. Validation, which we didn't even really talk about. Forms are just hard. So is there a more fundamental solution? And I'm going to propose there is, and it's dedicated form trees. So let's look at that same example, and let's sort of expand it here. So you can see we've got a form on the outside, and then we've got a user input, a user component, two text inputs, and then a bunch of DOM. We could graph that just like I did on the right-hand side there. That is basically the tree of this form. But interestingly enough, if you actually think about what's being used, the tree for the form looks more like this. All those DOM elements and everything else melts away. They don't matter. Even the form data API does this, right? If you ask a form for its data, it goes down to any depth inside and it pulls it out. Unfortunately, it pulls it out in a really bad way. And native HTML has been doing this really since 1995. If the spec has hardly changed since 1995, when people thought this was cool. So we surely have evolved more than that, haven't we? Let's look at that form data a little bit. Well, okay, you can't structure the data. You can't track any state. The keys in form data are not unique, which is really bananas. So if you have two inputs named name, they both somehow end up in the data. You can't rehydrate a form, right? Like I can't put values into form data and then they end up back on the inputs. So I can't fill the form back out. The validation UX is garbage. There's a lot of problems. So my hypothesis here is that the web is missing some basic form primitives. Let's look at that. Imagine a little password input here. And this password input is inside of a form. Well, we just talked about the fact that the password needs to be able to give its value to the form, right? And form data does that. Unfortunately, form data doesn't do the next part, which is allow you to, from the form, give your value back to the input. Now imagine I have a confirm password. Uh-oh. Now these two inputs actually need to communicate with each other. The password needs to communicate, or the confirm password needs to communicate with the form as well and be communicated to, but they need to also communicate with each other. Now imagine that this is inside of an account details section where all of the values underneath that are being aggregated, maybe under a key of like account or something like that. So now they need to be able to communicate with account details, which in turn needs to be able to communicate with the form and the form back to it. But then imagine that this is just an array of accounts. Your boss comes to you and says, actually, we need to be able to have more than one. And now you have some sort of a repeater structure. And in this case, the account details need to all communicate to the account, which is communicating to the form. And then those need to be able to communicate with each other. And it's a mess, right? It's a mess. So the web is missing basic primitives that allow us to create this structure. This is the same form, just structured. Things like a group, which could equate to things like objects, and lists, which equate to things like arrays, and then inputs, which equate to scalar values. So FormKit does this, which is our open source solution to how to solve this problem. And we do it basically by leveraging both of these solutions. Yes, we ship Vue components because we want to make sure that you don't have to write all that boilerplate code and non-native inputs like autocompletes are handled and that accessibility is handled. And we ship every single native input out of the box. And then the like little paid feature, which we're trying to support our open source project with, is sort of this little extra paid group of extra inputs. But the rest of this is being handled by that tree architecture, which is fundamentally an architectural solution to forms. So let's take a look at this user component, which I think agree is a little bloated and not so happy. How would we do the same thing in FormKit? Because this is not scalable. So in FormKit, we would just wrap this in a FormKit type form. And then instead of having all of this, you would just write the user component. And that's it. You don't need to bind any props down. They are automatic. All of that data is automatically injected and the state is tracked for you. How about the user component itself? How would we implement that? Well, we would just have two inputs, type text with first name and a type text with the last name. And these would automatically be communicating to the parent without any further work. Now, if I want to get the data back, I just add a submit handler, write a little function here, and the data that gets passed in is already structured the way I'm expecting. Nothing too fancy here, right? Now, what if I wanted my data, though, to be structured a little bit more? So I want that user to be nested under that user property key. Well, to do that, all I need to do is add a little bit of structure here. So I'm going to say type group, name user, and this automatically ends up being that property key. Again, no prop drilling here, no need to pass the errors down through there. And if I were to implement something like validation, I would just put the validation rules that are required on the inputs that are required, and then the validation state of the entire form tree is automatically tracked for me. No need for those errors to be piped up and down the tree. Fun fact, you can also just write a configuration that's hierarchical and pass something like validation down to any of the children. So here you can see I'm using config, validation required, and now all the inputs underneath are automatically required. Okay, so a form tree. Now, this is our implementation. You might want to write your own at some point. But essentially, it looks like this, right? We have a form, and we create something called a node, which is like a mini application, a tiny little application, which is responsible with communicating with the rest of your form. And then inside of there, we can have a component like user, but really that one doesn't matter. It's just sort of in this graph to orientate you, but it's not important. It's transparent to the form tree. And then inside of there, we have a group in this case with nodes underneath of text. So what if I want to add another input here? Okay, so I'm going to just add FormKit type number. And then what would happen to my form tree? Do I need to bind it somehow? No, it's just going to automatically recognize, oh, that was inside the form. It creates a new node, and my tree continues to get structured in that way. Or what if I need an array of data somehow? Well, I can say FormKit type list with a select and checkbox in it. And this would automatically then create a list, which is an array structure with inputs inside of it. And so the structure of your form is automatically produced by the way you lay things out. All right, I'm going to risk a demo here. And hopefully, I know nobody has internet, so well, that's not the demo. All right, here we go. Here is a very basic little homepage. And Evan, you for president, we've got a little like pricing table here. And now I can just pop over to the edit page here. I'm going to go to /edit, and we can look at the form that's powering this. Okay, so we've got some page details up here, nothing too exciting. We got an image in the hero, and here you can kind of see my page sections, sort of. I got a hero section, call to action section, some pricing details, and a testimonial. Okay, now let's go look at the implementation of this. Not there, here. Okay. So here is the page that's rendering that. You can see I have a section hero where I'm passing some data through. How this is getting stored is really not the point, although it's getting fetched from KV store. Here's a call to action and section testimonial and pricing. And those are really basic little things. Oops, I'm in the editor section. Here you go. So here's just a bunch of DOM that lays things out. Not really worth looking at. What I'm a little bit more interested in is the actual form that's powering that. And so I'm just going to show this to you here. Here's a FormKit type form, and then you can just see all of the inputs underneath here. But this is a long and hideous form. And I would say, against our rubric of scalability, it's not performing all that well, even though we're using FormKit. So what I want to show you is that we could break these out. So here you can see I've got page details right here. So I could just get rid of this, and I could use my page details component. And if I go take a look at what that guy's doing, you can see it's the same code here. I've literally just copied and pasted it into a separate component and included it. Now, if I save this and come back over here, you can see literally nothing changed. And if I were to edit this, it would work exactly like it would have worked before. It would automatically have all of the same bindings, even though we're not prop drilling down to it. And I can keep doing this. In fact, I've got a little snippet here just to copy and paste to save us all some time. I can just do this with all of my components in here. So this entire FormKit form can just be replaced with components. Now, this is wonderful if you think about it, because we've broken the tight coupling between the owning component and the children, which means I could take that page details and I could move it and reuse it at will and get the same API interface without having to recreate all of the binding that goes around it. And the same is true with editor hero, editor testimonial, call to action, all of these. And just to take a look, these are exactly the same code up here that we were copy and pasting before, that we removed. And the end result of this is literally the same form. It works exactly the same. But that's really not quite good enough. Now, what if I wanted to make this more flexible? Because something about this does not scream like a great CMS. I have literally the page sections are tightly stitched to their places. Maybe I want this to be a little more CMS-y where I can actually like move things around on the page. So I am going to use this right here, and we'll walk through it and take a quick look at it. Whoops. Okay, so here you can see I've got a FormKit type repeater named sections. And then inside of here, I have something that's a radio that allows me to pick out various sections. And if you look at what the sections are, they're somewhere up here, getting composed in, component map. Here's our little sections. It's just a key value map. And when I select one, whenever I select a section, the value of section is going to automatically be populated, and this input will disappear because there's a VIF on it. Now, normally the value would then disappear as well in FormKit, which is something it does automatically for you. But I've got this preserve prop on here to keep that value, even though the input disappears. And then I'm using a dynamic component to just render whichever selection was made. And so here is that exact same form now rendered inside of these repeaters. So I can just move these items around on my page. And all I need to do then is update the way that this is rendering, because this is no longer going to be just a hard-coded list of sections that need to appear. Instead, we could go grab something like this here, where we're using another dynamic component. So component, we're going to v-for over the sections, the data sections, and then we're going to just bind those props through. And if we go over to, let's see here, let's go ahead and save this form, and we'll go to our home page. You can see that we're now reading those page sections automatically. So let me go to localhost edit, and we'll make some proof of concept change here. Let's add a new section at the bottom here. And now it's going to ask me section types to add, hero, testimonial, call to action, or pricing. Let's add a testimonial. This is the best talk I have ever heard. Internet work, please. Hey, it did. Internet work, please. All right. Here you can see our section is rendered on the front end. So that was basically creating a very simple little CMS with repeating fields, with repeating sections that automatically appear. And by the way, it's like fully validated. We know the validation state at any point. And the amount of code that was actually used in this is pretty astoundingly small. I mean, this is really all of those page sections because we were able to break them up into their own little components, and they automatically flowed everywhere that they needed to go. So let's run through this. Scalable front ends. Did we enable code reuse? Yeah, absolutely. We did it with a distinct form tree. Encourage best practices? Yes, all of those inputs were shipping fully accessible out of the box. Approachable for all skill levels? I think so, yes. And conducive to a team of developers? Absolutely. This is used by a lot of large teams at big companies. So yes, single component is also a keyword. That's one of the reasons, if you noticed, all of them are called FormKit type. And one of the reasons that we do that is so anytime you see that, you know that it's participating in that form tree. And that's it. Thank you very much. Hopefully we learned something.